content here. So hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, my name is Audrey Grace. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the relatively new Associate Vice President for Inclusive Excellence and Chief Diversity Officer at Regis. I'm very excited to be partnering with the Center for Instructional Innovation, and thank you for inviting me and having me here as part of the series to talk about building inclusive spaces in your learning environment. There is so much information out there now about inclusive learning environments, and particularly in online when everyone was moving remote. So I spent a lot of time last night doing some deep dives into some wonderful content. The Teaching at Regis blog also has a post with some fabulous resources, an article from the Chronicle. There's a link to Columbia University has an inclusion by design sort of resource guide. And so I hope to go through that with you today, but also the focus here, I think, will be on talking with you about workshopping some of the ideas that you have for building inclusive spaces. Again, this is just my contact information. The Center for Inclusive Excellence, we have a social media account. We do not have a TikTok account yet, but I am told that TikTok is wildly fun, so perhaps one day. And so this is where you can reach us. And again, that's me. And then Denise Masson-Charmy is the Associate Director for Inclusive Excellence. So with that, I want to go to the poll because I want to get to know you in a different way. So if you're able to access that poll everywhere link, if you can visit that now. Was everyone able to access that?
Oh yeah, but this is very difficult to respond on the spot. This is a complex question.
Of course it is. But the fabulous part about this poll is you can upvote other people's responses. So if someone shares something that you agree with, you can vote it and then it will rise to the top. So I'm not asking for a thought out. This is merely an introduction to where you're coming from and what brings you into this room and where you stand today as you come in. So it can be 2 to 3 words. What does inclusive teaching and learning, online or otherwise, mean to you? I love presenting to faculty and using polls because I love the full sentences and the punctuation involved in these polls. It's very interesting. All right, so we have 3 responses so far, 1 upvote. We have from trying to reach the weak and the strong. So I believe that means making sure you're reaching everyone in your classes. It means treating students' voices and experience as important and worthy of attention, deliberate strategies to help honor everyone, considering the diverse learning needs of my students and creating an environment that makes students feel comfortable, sharing and participating. Yeah, so I see a lot of words about deliberate nature of this work, attention, reaching all students and making sure they feel comfortable. All right, love it. Let's do another poll. So stay on that screen. Now, different from what inclusive learning environment means to you, when you think of an inclusive learning environment, what does that look like? If you had no restrictions, if you had all the technology in the world, if you had all the resources in the world, what would your ideal inclusive learning environment look like? Imagery is diverse and inclusive, signaling safety and respect for all. Imagery. Imagery meaning the course material that you use. Everyone is able to see themselves and feel comfortable to speak and express themselves.
So may I ask,
Sorry, what do
does
we
this
mean
is
by
not the
senior
moment,
science? Sorry, what
does
is?
this is not the moment to ask, and if you rather for me to ask later?
No, no. If you have a question, you can ask.
Okay, so I think this is a good answer, but if we, I am a little bit unsure on how to deal with safety. Means the discussion we had until this moment, I think I can do respect, I hope I can do respect, but safety, it's a much more troublesome concept, especially because there are teaching the past. Well, there are plenty of bad things that happen.
Sure.
And so I don't exactly know how to deal with that. I cannot take them off, all of them.
So
Um,
can I just ask a question? That when you said, when you're asking about safety and and how to create that, I don't see it. Are you responding to this poll that inclusive environment looks safe
yes,
to you? Okay,
yes, yes.
and then you're asking for tools to help create that safe space. Okay, yep, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
Perfect. All right, one more, and then we'll stop this. This is a fun one. You just click on an image. So how comfortable are you with building inclusive learning environments online? And I would say there's 5 images of faces here, and you click on one from a severe frowny face to a very happy green face. What's your comfort level? And I acknowledge that the association with this sort of pain chart that they use in the doctor's office probably isn't the best analogy to use in this case. So sorry about that. I do see that and I acknowledge it. So thank you for going through that exercise with me. That really helps me understand a little bit about what you hope to gain from this experience and what you're imagining coming in here. So a quick overview, this is some of the things we'll talk about today. We will talk about the importance of a positive course climate. This applies wherever and however you teach. We'll talk about some of the barriers to building a positive course climate, and we'll talk about building inclusive spaces online. I would also say I'm always very firm of belief that inclusion in your classroom, it doesn't matter if you're online or in person or on the beach. Inclusive strategies work everywhere. They work differently, but they work everywhere. And good inclusive teaching practices are good inclusive teaching practices, no matter how you do it. The thing we will not talk about is the first is identity, culture, and self-reflection. One of the key aspects of building inclusive spaces is understanding your own self, your own identity, and your own blind spots. You have to do that work yourself to see where you might have blind spots that you need to uncover, unpack, and address. That is a hefty topic, and we only have an hour here today, but just know and acknowledge that that is something that is a prerequisite for this work. We will not delve into unconscious bias and how that impacts how we construct our courses and how we see our students. That is also another 2.5-hour workshop. And I'm not the expert on course design or instructional design, that's Edna. So I'm not going to talk about that, about setting up your course. I will say that I've just had my first foray into Moodle, and I am struggling heavily, so I empathize with you. And I also wanted to make you aware that I am not the person to go to when you want to talk about how to set up your course and sort of Moodle and how to think about instructional design. I will not talk about UDL and universal design learning. That's not my area of expertise, but that is something that we should strive for, and we do. And UDL and inclusive design does help and is integral and part of making inclusive learning environments. And there's a lot more I won't talk about because of the time, but there's also other opportunities for learning and growth, and I will provide you with more resources where you can do that work yourself too, after, if you so choose. All right, so let's talk about some of the common fears and challenges people generally have when thinking about inclusive learning environments. They struggle with how can you create a positive course climate for students? How do you know if your course climate is working for students? one of my students said something offensive in class. What should I do? And that's sort of that paralyzing fear of not knowing what to do when you see something that's recognized as offensive, but just don't know how to respond in the moment. Or even more impactful sometimes, or at least for me, mortifying for me, I said something offensive. So what do I do now, right? And so these are some of the common fears and challenges that people generally have. But it's important that we sort of put aside our fears and engage in this work, because course climate really does matter. I'm just going to go quickly through this. So classroom climate refers to sort of the sense of warmth and support within a learning environment. When we talk about course climate, it's the intellectual, emotional, and physical environments in which students learn, wherever they are. Cultivating a positive classroom climate increases students' academic success. We know that. We know that there's a correlation with climate and learning. And it's not just in your particular course, but in the university, in the sense of self in the university as a whole. The other thing that we know is that the sense of belonging is related to college students' cognition, affect, and behaviors. So a student who thinks, that's the cognition part, and feels the affect part, that they belong in a class, is more likely to show up to class. And I think that you can reason that in your head for your own work, right? If you've ever felt included in the space, that you want to participate, you want to show up, you want to be active, you want to raise your hand, you want to participate, you want to share at that meeting, it's because you have a sense of belonging. But I'm sure you can also think to a time where you didn't feel like your voice was being heard, you didn't want to participate, and you, therefore, the sense of belonging impacted your ability to participate fully in those discussions or those groups. But I just want to emphasize here that the research on sense of belonging is on perception. And so it's the student's perception of their sense of belonging. And that's why this is important. So all of these strategies to build an inclusive learning environment focus on recognizing, acknowledging, and supporting the students so that they do not perceive the environment as exclusive to them. Some of the elements of a positive classroom climate is one that's supportive. There's the sense of belonging, there's the motivation, engagement. It's accessible. We talked about UDL, but there's also the accessibility needs for people of all abilities, and the need to design your course so that no student will ever have to ask for an accommodation because your course is fully accessible from the outset. It is inclusive. A positive classroom climate is welcoming, helpful, respectful, and open to different voices, which is some of the things you mentioned in your poll. It's equitable. It attends to the different student experiences and backgrounds, but it also addresses the historic and current disadvantages of current populations. So if we think about representing all the students that come into our classroom, but also all the historic systemic disadvantages that the students bring into the classroom as well. So if you think about a positive campus climate, you have your open communication, your supportive relationships, you're listening to the students' perspectives, you're using inclusive language and practices, you're encouraging student questions and cooperations, and you're attending to the students' needs for accessibility, right? So that's the positive aspect of it too. I could list for you the negative aspects of if you have a negative classroom climate, what that looks like, but I'm sure you could think of it. It's exact opposite, right? Their students feel excluded, alienated. There results in disrespect and verbal aggression. And that's really what we're trying to avoid, because the learning does not happen when the negative classroom climate impacts your ability to be there. This is one model I'd like to share with you from my brilliant colleague, Alexia Ferracuti from the Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning and Research at Northeastern University. And I loved it because she already did the PowerPoint animations for me. So I didn't have to spend all that time adding those in, because sometimes that can be a bear. But when she talks about course climate, she talks about how we can, that course climate is an overarching consideration. So you're developing cognizance, you're developing awareness of the identities and the positionalities within and beyond the classroom. And the positionalities are the identities within the particular context. And what happens is, there's a course climate that can be explicitly marginalizing to those positionalities and identities, implicitly marginalizing, implicitly centralizing, and explicitly centralizing in all of your campus climate. What you want, the goal is, and this generally, generally what we do when we move through the world without acknowledging our own unconscious biases and how the students bring themselves in the room, our courses end up being implicitly marginalizing in that it's not your intention, it's not the students in your class, and it's not their intention to exclude others, but they're implicitly doing so by not recognizing and valuing the diverse voices in the room. What we want to do, the goal is we want to go towards explicitly centralizing the marginalized identities in our classroom. And why do we do that? Well, all the research on sense of belonging and student perception show us that in particular, for students or underrepresented minority students, the study was based on underrepresented minority students, they tend to report a lower sense of belonging than their peers in predominantly white institutions overall. So that's outside, that's you know, you could not have a course and they would feel that way entering the institution. But in particular, these students struggle in any kind, they internalize this sort of their sense of belonging and their inability to sort of activate their knowledge and succeed in the course, and they internalize that as they move forward. So therefore, they are taking these messages that are shared by them, by the institution, into your course. So they're already coming into it with an idea that they don't belong in your course. Not that they can't do well academically, but that they don't belong there because their identities are not recognized and recognized and appreciated in those spaces. So that's why we have to move towards explicitly centralizing marginalized voices. Again, so in explicitly centralizing them, historically marginalized groups and perspectives are validated in spontaneous discussions and intentionally and overtly integrated into context. I forgot that animation from Alexia, sorry. I should have called her about this. So let's talk about how we do this, how we build inclusive learning environments. Just want to refine what we're talking about. When we talk about inclusive teaching, it's intentionally cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably and have equal access to learning and feel valued and supported. So that's, you know, the open communication, the respect and validation, the listening. It's attending students' needs, encouraging students' questions. It's the same list I gave you before of positive campus climate. But what it's not, inclusive teaching is not cultivating a learning environment where all students are comfortable. Comfort does not equal learning. And to your point, Professor Pellegrino, about safety, learning does not happen when people feel safe and comfortable. We look for those stretch opportunities where people feel supported, but challenged in their ideas. So then they can come into the space where there's a place of learning and growth. Right? Does that make sense to people? You could think back on the most cathartic or the most impactful learning moments in your career, and there were probably ones where you felt a little bit uncomfortable, where you felt like you had to sort of rethink some of the things that you believed or held to be true. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit and how we could do steps to building inclusive course climate. And these are 3 steps. The first is to build community. The second is to set the tone. And the third is to do regular assessments and check-ins. So I'm going to go one by one, and I'll stop as we go through each one so we can talk about them. And when we talk about building community is fostering personal connections among your students and fostering personal connections and rapport between the student and yourself as the instructor. So when you're fostering your personal connections and you're building that rapport with your students, think about ways in which you can provide opportunities for students to meet one another, to get to know one another, and to talk to one another in a low pressure manner. So you're giving them prompts and discussion where they can pair up and share with one another. They can work together on developing a model where they have an introductory video together. Anything that you could do to be collaborative in your spaces at the outset to build that community will help them build that rapport among one another. With yourself, you also have to work to build the rapport with yourself as the instructor and your students. So these are, you know, your using your video to do your video introduction for students so they get to know you at the outset. You are modeling good behavior for how you talk about your own identity. So when you introduce yourself, you talk about your social positionality as you come into the classroom. You model the proper use of name pronunciation and pronoun use. So you model the expectation for the students that that is the behavior that you expect in your class. You are in regular communication with your students, so they feel like that you're an active participant in the course, and you're an active participant in their learning journey, and you're going along with them. So the challenge you see, and so that's the communication connection as well. But the challenge you say is, like, what about community online? And Edna tells me that most of you have, other than the massive moves online, but most of you have some more in-depth experience in online learning. So let's talk about the importance of community online. Community online is the same thing as community in the classroom. There's some little tricks, though, that you can do to build community online a little bit more deeper. So these are small things, right? So think about the first day of your online class. If you're doing a synchronous class, what do the students see when they appear on the screen? Are they entering the Zoom room in silence, or do you have music playing? Have you sent out notifications in advance about introducing yourself? Have you informed them in advance of all of the technology tools that you'll be using in your course, and given them the space to practice, so that they come into your space knowing how to use the tools that you have made available to them, that they don't feel that they're behind because they don't know how to use the tools. Clearly, I shouldn't have used a poll everywhere tool, but without sending it in advance, but next time. I'm not the best pre-preparer. I prefer crushing deadlines to get things done. But again, I'm going to just stop this for a second. So the next tip for building an inclusive learning environment is to set the tone. Now, I was trying to find an image for set the tone, but I've been watching Hamilton on Disney Plus, so I thought set the stage. But I didn't really want to change my my course title because it's in the description of this workshop. So please forgive the difference there. But you want to set the stage / tone from in all levels, and then we're just talking about the introduction, right? So you want to start with your inclusive course design. You want to make it accessible. You want to think about, you want to use universal design concepts. You want to think about even the color scheme of your presentations can be inaccessible to some, the size of your fonts, access to external resources, and whether or not so a student would have to pay for other resources or tools. You want to make sure that you're very clear at the outset about the expectations of your response time, right? So you don't want a student to feel like they shared something with you that was painful and powerful and cathartic in an email, and you don't respond immediately because you have lives and you have lives and dreams and life to eat and go to the bathroom and fall asleep. And so it's not, but you want them to know that you have a 24-hour response time, so they don't think that you are either uncomfortable talking about what they shared with you or unwilling to. You want to make sure that in your course, as you're building it, that you're thinking about using multiple diverse examples in your images, in your instructional materials. You want to think about how your language and your syllabus is about inclusivity. What does inclusivity mean to you in your opening statement in your syllabus? What do you want expectations around what students should do should they face a hardship, and put that in your syllabus, because that is kind of like the key text of that students will always refer to say, what do I do next? I would say hopefully, because I mean, how many emails do you have to say like, that's in the syllabus? But anyway, the other thing you want to do is make sure you treat each student like an individual. What happens when we're raised in a society where we have racial hierarchies and gender hierarchies and sexual orientation hierarchies is that the people at the top are not aware that they're at the top, because they're never taught that they're at the top. And but they understand that people are at the bottom of those racial hierarchies. And so what we do, the people who are at the top, they treat everyone at the bottom as one homogenous group, right? So you think low-income people of color didn't have a good high school experience and they need extra support. And that's a generalization that you're making of everyone. Um, but what you want to do is you want to invite the students to participate before, and don't make any assumptions about their race or demographic group, because then you're removing their individuality. You're not allowing them the space to share with you their experience and what they're actually bringing to the classroom. Yes, generalizations are helpful because we can, well, we know this in academia, we can generalize and it's helpful for us to frame our knowledge and understanding, but it's harmful to the student to generalize or impute behaviors based on what they look like or where they're from. So how can you get to know your students as an individual? What are you doing to allow them to introduce themselves to you? And so they can share with you their life experiences before you make an assumption. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. The other thing is well-established ground rules. This is also something that you can do in advance before the course even starts. Ground rules are helpful in all of these interactions. They're helpful for your students. If a ground rule is we treat each other as individuals, then you can constantly refer to your ground rules when you notice that's not happening in your class. Or if or it also invites the students to share with you when you're not treating them as an individual, because these are sort of the laws of the class that you're creating together. You should try to construct these ground rules in whatever way possible with your students. Yes, you can have some standard ground rules and you can have some standard expectations, and there's some in the sample syllabus, right? Like timeliness of discussions, citing facts in your discussion post. But there's also personal ground rules that you should consider. And I'll send you as a resource a fabulous article by Sensoy and D'Angelo, but it's about challenging established ground rules, and the idea is that, in the ground rules we have developed over, decades are in these facilitated group conversations, privileged dominant voices, right? Because if you're having everyone share about their ground rules, who's going to be the loudest voice in the room about the ground rules, but the people who have the more dominant voices. And so this is actually where being online is way more beneficial, because there's some tools that equalize voices in the room and have equal opportunities to participate in these discussions. So if you set the stage and tone for students to participate in creating the ground rules and standards that would make them learn in a space where they feel like they can share their voice equally, and the voice will be equally appreciated, then that will help in the beginning. The other is send positive messages. As I said in the beginning about the internalized sense of how students internalize the lack of belonging, they also internalize stereotypes. And if you're familiar with the concept of stereotype threat, that's the anxiety that one's behavior is going to confirm a negative stereotype about one's group. And that is most apparent in academia, where there's stereotypical notions about who is good in school and who is not. Black students do not perform well in school. That's a stereotype. It's also something that, again, like, you want to treat your students as an individual, so you don't want to impose that assumption or stereotype. But this is also internalized in the student. And so their perception of their natural ability, this internalized stereotype, is going to override their ability to succeed in the course. And the study that confirmed that was about women in math. So there was have you heard this one? There's a test, and it was a math test, and there was two groups. It was a gender diverse students taking the test. In one of the tests, they didn't say anything about demographic information. They took the test and scored it. And the other one, they said in the beginning, they asked demographic information, including gender, right? So they asked that at the forefront. So you had to check off your gender. And then just by having them check off their gender in the beginning, women performed less well on the test, just by simply the fact of asking about gender, right? So it's your job to be mindful of sending those positive messages that you belong here, you can succeed, and I believe in you. It's not I'll go easy on you, right? Because that also reinforces that negative stereotype. But it's that you're affirming their presence in the classroom, right? Like, they're not here by accident. They are here because we know you can academically succeed in this environment. And the coursework is going to be challenging, but just because it's challenging doesn't mean you don't belong and you can't do well. There's an article on, it's called Wise Feedback, that will give you, I can send around as well. It will give you strategies for how to have these sort of conversations if you notice someone is academically struggling, to send those positive messages. And the other one, again, is to set the tone, is to encourage those class and peer interactions. So look, like online facilitation is exhausting for instructors. It's exhausting. Think about how many messages you're receiving at the same time. You're not just looking at visual clues, and now you can see everyone's face and it's the same size, so you're even more inclined to pay attention to those little cues and eyebrow raises, or you know, people who aren't paying attention. But there's also written feedback, right? Because you're simultaneously getting chats back and forth, right? And so you have to pay attention to that. And in addition, there's the verbal feedback, so people are also talking. So now you're managing 3 forms of communication, all while trying to say, crap, I have to listen if anything offensive happens. Can we edit the crap out of the recording later? Edit for content. But so that's all, that's, you know, you're dealing with this all right now too. So think about how you can structure your class so that you can use the class and peer interactions to not only foster student rapport, but you're also creating that space where you can focus your attention on other things, you know, one thing at a time. You're focusing on the student interaction, you're focusing on their report back. It allows you the space to really hold that inclusive learning environment, right? Yeah, it's just I don't want to say like this is the easiest way for you to do it, but it is the most effective way for you to make sure your your environment remains inclusive. All right, let's stop this for a second and talk about that. But the third way is to just assess regularly. And assess is not just, you know, you build in those low stakes quizzes and opportunities to check learning, right? So throughout the course. And so in an online environment, the more you can do those quick checks, it's also easier because it's all readily available and quick, and you can have it built into your course. Those are great ways to check in with the learning, but you also want to develop surveys and polls to see how students are socially succeeding in your course. So think about ways in which they're demonstrating whether or not they are experiencing personal concerns. Or if, for example, if they're struggling with the technology or they don't have access to Wi-Fi, how can you build in little assessments in your course to make sure that you're checking in on them? The other point I'll mention here is to think about how you balance both synchronous and asynchronous office hours. The synchronous does have that human touch, but once you establish that rapport and community, you can think about creating more opportunities for asynchronous check-ins or class meetings, or and because you're it's allowing that access to yourself and your understanding of just basically overview of the content without having continuous synchronous meetings, but you're still giving everyone the access to the content. The self-assessment is just, again, reflect on yourself, your personal yourself, and revisit recordings of your classes to just look at yourself and think critically of maybe interactions that you could have facilitated differently, and then learn from those as well. You might want to think about inviting a colleague in to watch a video to look at how you presented the content and maybe give you some feedback. But this is where I love talking about, is where things go wrong. And this is an image of a big, long screen when things go wrong. The first is, you know, we talk about a lot about growth versus fixed mindset. And if you don't know, the fixed mindset is assuming that, you know, everything is static and your mindset, your character, your intelligence cannot be changed. And there's a lot of push towards thinking about a growth mindset that, you know, a challenge is an opportunity for growth, and you thrive on it. And so you see failure as an opportunity for learning, and everyone is pushing the growth mindset. I would say growth mindset is not just for students, but it's also for teachers. Sometimes we forget that we also need to have a mindset. So we also can't have a fixed mindset. We also need to be continually learning and engaging. I'm saying this to an audience that voluntarily showed up here, so I think you get it. But I just also want to note one little critique or caution about the growth versus fixed mindset. There is a lot of very legitimate critique about the idea of a growth versus fixed mindset, wherein that some the growth mindset, and sometimes they talk about the concept of grit and resilience in conjunction with this. It's sometimes makes it seems like it's the student's choice or fault that they are not succeeding after failure, or they're not rising to the challenge. And it's completely ignoring the systemic influences and dynamics that have created the environment in which students feel as though they cannot succeed from a challenge, and that failure is inevitable. So by thinking solely about the growth versus fix, it's not looking at the history of involvement and where students come to the experience there too. So the preferred model, at least for me, is the asset versus deficit based. Here's another thing you should take out of the recording, because I kept writing asses in this whole presentation. So please forgive me if that came out in the recording as well. So I'm getting a little saucy on Thursday. So when you think about the asset versus deficit based model, this is the again, when things go wrong, is that we don't want our mind to shift to think that we don't want to start only thinking about what students can't do. Like deficit models, like, oh, they can't do this, they can't do that, and focusing only on the negative. But when you look at it from an asset based perspective, you're looking at what the students can do. So you're focusing on highlighting their strengths, skills, talents, interests, and competencies. Yes, you're still trying to teach them and a topic and move them through the course, but it's your role to think about what are the students' strengths, what are they building in this conversation, and how can I enhance their strengths in this moment to help the learning environment for everyone, right? So when we talk about incorporating students' voice in the conversations and discussions, highlight those students who do have strengths in sharing their stories or voices, or who think differently about how they present their work. So maybe a student is a great artist and you ask them to do graphic representation of a concept in your course. You're taking one of their strengths and you're connecting it to your course content, and it benefits everyone, right? Because I'm sure there's other learners in your classroom that would prefer a visual representation of the content. So there's that. I'll move through, sorry, I'm moving through this quickly because I want to talk to you more. The other thing is about microaggressions, miscommunication, and other hot moments. So microaggression is a slight snub or insult, which conveys a derogatory or negative insult towards a marginalized identity. Microaggressions happen all the time online. Sometimes they're not so micro, they're macroaggressions. The online community, again, is rife with miscommunication, the opportunity for miscommunication. Communicating online asynchronously or in writing is a skill, it is a challenge, and it's not something that everyone has. And so miscommunication happens all the time. So when you think about how these play out in online environments, you have to be able to be ready to recognize in the moment. So if you're doing breakout rooms and sessions, and you want to make sure that you create the space, if you're not in the room with a group of students, that you have a system which they feel comfortable sharing with you if a microaggression happens in the space where you're not present, right? Or if you have a asynchronous discussion board and you don't check it for 48 hours and you come back and there's a microaggression in the discussion board, you need to think about what your strategy is for responding and addressing the harm in the room. And so that's what we talk about, preparing for hot moments. And so the first start is your ground rules. So at the outset of your course, you need to be aware that these moments will happen and think about how you will establish ground rules to recognize them, and work with your students on that too, right? So have that discussion when you're developing your ground rules together. Say, okay, so, what if something hurtful happens in a discussion board post? How should we as a group handle that together? What should we do? And so you invite them to participate in that conversation, and you also activate other voices in the room to respond in the moment when you just physically can't, right? The other thing is you can't just delete the student comment. It's not enough to just delete. Just like if you're an in-person environment, it's not enough to, like say, all right, class is over. We'll come back next time. See you later. You can delete the comment, but you must also do something. Because an unaddressed microaggression has as much harm as the microaggression itself. So if you leave it unaddressed, you're exacerbating the harm and perhaps creating more harm for other people in the room. And you really want to model good behavior there. So if tensions do arise, you want to acknowledge it. If you're not capable of addressing it in the moment, and not all, there's a lot of microaggressions we're not comfortable addressing in the moment. You think like that was kind of a bad comment. They shouldn't have said that, but I don't know why just yet. But just make sure you develop the strategies to come back to it later. So think about how you can have a plan to do so. And there's wonderful strategies that kind of correlate to this assessment piece from before to address microaggressions. So think about the group breakout sessions. Can you have a discussion in your team, maybe a fishbowl exercise where you have a few people on the Zoom call kind of unpack how they felt about the moment while everyone else is watching, and then have the observers kind of share back what they heard from the conversation. You could do that very easily on Zoom. You can do sort of a think, pair, and share where you talk about the moment, or even you just talk about the history or the impact of certain microaggressions in a way that's educational. And you can have them think, pair, and share. So think, they think to themselves; pair, they talk to one another; and share, they share it to the group, and allows different strategies, different stages of engagement with the material. There's many other moments. There's a wonderful, fabulous resource, the Derek Bach Center for Teaching and Learning at Harvard, which has a great guide, discussion guide I can send to you as well. The other thing I want to talk about before we leave is awkward moments. How many times have you been on Zoom and it's just like silence or just a bunch of blank screens? And it's super uncomfortable because you spent all this time designing a course where you really want to have this fruitful, wonderful, beautiful conversation, and it just, no one is there. Or you have a moment where your audio stops and your internet dies, and you realize you have this frozen face that is not very welcoming or or kind of silly. And the first thing you want to do is just pause and breathe. I mean, there's always going to be awkward moments. It's just that sometimes the transition online for students, it's new, so it's going to be more awkward until we get used to it. And you just want to pause and breathe, and you sort of want to laugh at yourself in some moments, particularly in those ones where you're frozen. But for students who are not participating or their videos off, just go back to the beginning. You're treating them as individuals, so don't make assumptions about why they're doing it, right? So don't say that they don't want to be here, they're not engaged, they're not learning the content, they're learning the content. You can't assume that. People participate differently. So you want to also vary the opportunities for participation. You cannot solely rely on discussions via Zoom where everyone's video's on, you're talking to one another. And yes, that might seem comfortable and familiar. That's my preferred way of having discussions. But you may also think about using polls or chats, or like you were suggesting, breakout rooms. So you're sort of redefining what participation means, particularly if you're grading for participation. You don't want to only use one way to grade for participation and not offer other opportunities. You have to be able to get more comfortable silence, particularly in Zoom. It's particularly when you can't see everyone's face. It's very uncomfortable, but acknowledge that and get comfortable with that. Try to think about how you add structure to your group conversations. So the more structure students have and the more knowledge they have going into it, they'll know what's expected of them, and it's much in advance, and it's much more fruitful discussion. So the awkward silence mostly comes, as you said in the beginning, like this is a very deep question to ask me 30 seconds into this presentation. So if you can send out your discussion prompts in advance so they can think about it, then you'll have a much more fruitful discussion. You can also allow anonymous participation. The closing slide is a Microsoft form I'll show to you that I'm going to use here today. You can also think about, if we know awkward moments are going to happen, if we know that silence happens, what can you do in your ground rules or your expectations for students going into it? So you say at the outset, I'm going to expect you to keep your video on. That's my rule for discussion. And so you know that going into the course. But you also create the space to say, let me know if you have any concerns about that, if you have internet connectivity issues, if there's other reasons which prevent you from participating in this way, and we can work together on what those expectations mean. And so those are my awkward moments. So this is a really cool feature that I just figured out. Have you ever used Padlet? Okay. So all the resources I said I'd send to you, I put them on a Padlet. I'll send you this link, and you can also participate in this Padlet as well. Let me stop my share right now. No, I won't do that. I'll send it to you later, but I'll send you an example of it later after I go to the next screen. But it's essentially a Post-it board. And actually, you know what? I'll show it to you right now. Sorry. But so this is, I put all of the resources on this Padlet. And this is a way for you to help generate resources for yourself, and also benefits me because you send me great resources. But a Padlet is free for a certain number, but you can see it's a post-it board. So what I did here is I included a bunch of resources and tools. I tried to color code them in some sort of way. And you can have access to this. You can also rate things for your peers. So if you find a resource is helpful, you can give it some stars. There's other ways of rating it on Padlet too. But you can come in here and see all the resources I promised to send you, but you can also use it for your students, because this is a great way to talk about developing ground rules asynchronously. So if you're working with students workshopping ground rules, you can use a tool like the Padlet to have them post themes and content. It's not as good as the Teaching at Regis blog at all, because it's not a blog. It's my putting links on a page. It's definitely not as good as that, but feel free to engage with us as much as you want or can. And I welcome any additional resources that you have. I'll send the link in the chat.
I already did that for you, Audrey Grace.
Oh, love it. Love it. So the next, the last thing is this. I know we have time. I can send this to you too, but I like to close my online workshops with a little Quaker-like reflection. So if you can use this QR code or go to this link, this short link, which we can also put in the chat. It's 3 simple questions. If you can share with me, the form is anonymous. You could share with me one thing that surprised you about today, one thing that you'd like to know more about, and one thing you learned about yourself. If you're uncomfortable using the form, you can also send back your responses to me in the chat. It just won't be anonymous, but I can include it in the content too. So it's one thing that surprised you about today, one thing that you'd like to know more about, and one thing you learned about yourself. Can everyone access the form?
No. Audrey, where do we access this form?
I'll send it in the chat. So it's at this link right here.
Okay, thanks.
I'm super new to QR codes. Apparently you could just hold your phone up to it and take it.
Okay.
Microsoft Forms creates one for you. We're learning new things every day.
I put the link in chat as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So with that, I'll stop the recording, and then we can, if you have some time to